If you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy. Then he becomes your partner. Nelson Mandela. In the mid-17th century, South Africa was colonized by the British and Dutch. As these countries colonized, they often violated the rights of the native South Africans through oppression and discrimination. The native South Africans had the right to their natural resources. The whites had the responsibility to not discriminate and exploit the native South Africans. With many natural resources, South Africa was living in peace. That was until the Dutch and British colonized. The Dutch and British wanted all of South Africa's resources. South Africa had things like mining and manufacturing. They had minerals in mines with gold, platinum, chromium, coal, and diamonds. In their factories, they had iron, steel, food, chemicals, and machinery, all the things that the Dutch and British wanted. In the mid-17th century, the Dutch colonized on South Africa's coast in Cape Town. They wanted to expand, but the South African natives were there and ready to fight for their land. The Dutch and natives fought over the land and the resources. The Dutch came out of the fight victors and expanded their colonies. The British saw all the resources the Dutch were getting and wanted them too. In 1899 to 1902, the Dutch and British fought over the land and resources. The British won and the war ended. The British took over the Dutch colonies and made a new government. This government controlled all of South Africa. The all-white government made new laws, apartheid, and did not give blacks any rights. This was a problem for the South African natives. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in Maviso, South Africa. Mandela was baptized at the Methodist Church. His religion is Christian. In 1942, Nelson Mandela joined the African National Congress. Mandela attended Fort Hare and graduated in 1943. In 1944, he married Evelyn Mays and divorced in 1958. Evelyn was Nelson's first wife. In all, Nelson had 3 wives and 6 children. In 1962, Nelson was imprisoned for peacefully protesting and was released in 1990. In 1994, Nelson Mandela, aged 71, became president of South Africa, the first black president after apartheid. At 85 years old, Nelson Mandela retired from politics and started raising money for schools, clinics, and charities. In 2001, Nelson Mandela was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and in 2011, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. The ANC, African National Congress, is an all-black government that started in 1912. They were, and still are, fighting for the rights of the South African people. The ANC mostly protests peacefully. One of the main things they protested against was apartheid. Nelson Mandela, one of the leaders, joined the ANC in 1942. The law of apartheid, which means the state of being apart, was created by D.F. Mullen and Hendrik F. Verwoerd, which was passed in 1948. This law said that whites, blacks, and Asians would be separated. Apartheid made it so a black and white were not allowed to get married. If they did and had a kid, the kid would be considered all black. There were a lot of only white jobs and areas. For example, when a black wanted to enter an all-white area, they had to have their passbook, which had their fingerprint, a photo, and other information. Apartheid finally ended in 1991. When apartheid did end, a lot of whites were afraid of revenge. 3 years after apartheid ended, there was a new government. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned in 1962 for acts to overthrow the government. He was put in jail on Notorious Island. Notorious Island is a prison island, or known as the place of banishment. The island was called University Behind Bars. This was because prisoners were allowed to study subjects, but politics and military history were forbidden. Prisoners of Notorious Island could see mainland. When the guard brought Nelson Mandela to the island, his first words were, "This is the island where you will die." Nelson Mandela was released from jail in 1990 after 27 years in jail. I went for a long holiday for 27 years. Nelson Mandela. The president at the time, F.W. de Klerk, freed Nelson Mandela. He also ended the law of apartheid. Nelson Mandela was elected president in 1994 and finished in 1999. He was the president of a democracy government. Now the president is Jacob Zuma. Jacob was elected on May 9, 2009, and he is 71 years old. The capitals of South Africa are Cape Town, Pretoria, and Bloemfontein. Nelson Mandela died on December 5, 2013. He had 3 celebrations of life. The first was unorganized, South Africans surrounding the streets around his home. The second was organized by his friends, former freedom fighters, and world changers. The third, acting as his funeral, was tens of thousands of South Africans, dozens of presidents and prime ministers, gathering to honor the life of Nelson Mandela. When South Africa was taken over by the Dutch and British, their rights were taken away. They weren't allowed to peacefully protest, and because of that, hundreds of people died and/or thrown in jail. They had a right to peacefully protest against the government, especially when they weren't being treated equally. The South Africans had a right to not have their country taken over and not have a say in what was going to happen in South Africa. The natives also had a right to not have their natural resources taken away, especially when their economy revolved around their resources. The South African white government had a responsibility to keep South Africans safe and alive on Notorious Island. F.W. de Klerk had a responsibility to give South African people rights and to make sure they were treated equal. Nelson Mandela felt he had a moral responsibility to help the South African natives. The government had a responsibility to keep blacks and whites equal. The government had a responsibility to keep peace between blacks, whites, and the government. In the mid-17th century, South Africa was colonized by the British and Dutch. As these countries colonized, they often violated the rights of the native South Africans through oppression and discrimination. The native South Africans had the right to their natural resources. The whites had the responsibility to not discriminate and exploit the native South Africans.